I had announced that we would devote our attention to Hermeticism or the Hermetic tradition this evening, and then move on from there. Next Friday is the anniversary of the martyrdom of Montségur, which we have observed for many decades, and which is the Gnostic martyrdom of the Cathars. So we will do that a week from tonight. It will not be a regular lecture, but a ceremonial celebration plus some little sermonizing about the Cathar tradition. In any event, this evening that is not the case yet, and we beg your indulgence for some of the difficulties of the past week, sort of since, or more or less since Christmas and New Year's, wherein we ran into various difficulties, one of them being that my long-time friend and helper, Brian Campbell, had come down with a real bad flu, and this made it difficult for him to assist us in various ways, and we thank him for such, and also Mr. Richardson for such assistance as they gave us at that time. And now we hope that in one way or the other, in small numbers or larger, we will continue our Fridays, and this evening would be the first one of these series in the new year. Now, what was my intention, and still is, that we will trace as much as we can the manifestations of the esoteric tradition throughout history, and in so doing perhaps we will, hello there, come on in, we will there sort of reconstruct those efforts which have been put forth by often very well-informed and illumined people regarding the manifestations of the esoteric tradition. Now we need to keep in mind that in such matters one always has to start somewhere. And in this case I decided that the chronological point where we should start in the new age will be with what generally is considered, maybe not all that accurately, but still generally, really the beginning of the manifestation of this other tradition in our culture. And in so doing, I selected the Hermetic tradition, or as often it is called Hermeticism, as the point of focus for this evening. Now what we need to remember is that generally when people inquire about esoteric or even the occult, so to say, in our culture, they are really talking about one of two things, or maybe two things at the same time, which is the way I like to talk, because that way you have a certain choice of which one we are concerned about. But they are Gnosticism, which is our own favorite heresy, so to say, and Hermeticism or Hermetism, which bears the name of the god Hermes, and which, owing to the fact that a considerable amount of literature became available about this tradition throughout history, is also a very important documentation, let us say, of the tradition. And here and there you find organizations of one kind or the other, sometimes of a Rosicrucian provenance, which emphasize their relationship to the Hermetic tradition. Now, therefore, I thought that we'll take at least a brief look at that school or that tradition tonight, and then we can flesh that out with various. This is not for vegetarians to fleshing it out, you know. But in any event, with various other traditions and customs and practices and teachings which have accrued to that over the ages and thereby enrich the situation. So that being the case, let's start with the one whose name is so cleverly added to this tradition, namely Hermes. Now Hermes, Hermes in Greek, is we might say, the patron god of the Hermetic tradition, and is often taken up as a patron and as a teacher by various other occult groups, especially those that for a long time shied away from Gnosticism because of its condemnation as a heresy in olden days, and have really only revived their interest in comparatively recent times. But now, away from all that applesauce, as a Ceylonese friend of mine used to call it, I would ask him, well, how was, he was lecturing too. How was your lecture? Oh, I think my lecture was all right. I got plenty of applesauce for it. And so applause and applesauce are often apparently used together. In any event, applesauce or no applesauce, the name and in many ways the content given to this tradition comes from the Greek mythological family, namely Hermes, a Greek god of considerable import and fame, and then has been appropriated sometimes rightfully and sometimes maybe not with that much justification by various occult traditions. One of the reasons for that appropriation I can tell you right away, and that was that Hermeticism, being bearing the name of a pagan god and being of a being of a pagan Greek derivation, has never been condemned by the Catholic Church or the Orthodox Church as a heresy. When it has not been condemned as a heresy, then we have some justification in believing that it is not a heresy. A heresy is a breaking away from the main body of religious traditions, which, owing to the time frame that we are dealing with, would have been very largely the Christian tradition. And so we might say that the appearance of Hermes and consequently of a spiritual school that is attributed to and having a connection with Hermes has a particular keynote. And that keynote was definitely not Christian-oriented like the Gnostics, who regarded Jesus as pretty much as the new Messiah, if you want to use the term of the messenger from the greater, the divine world, and so it justly assumed a place among the Christian denominations. And it took the church fathers, quite a bit of work to somehow convince their congregants that these Gnostics were really bad people. They were heretics. They were teaching an approach to the Christian religion which was not taught by the mainstream church, and that therefore was questionable. Now, these points of view need to be considered and very briefly justified. In addition to these, however, there was a spiritual school which existed for quite a long time and which experienced a very strong, in fact I would say a fabulous revival at the time of the Renaissance, and that was Hermeticism, because the spiritual orientation which came forth largely as the result of the discovery of the Hermetic writings, the Hermetic books, which, believe it or not, took the scholars and various researchers, I can't even count how many, but I would say nearly 1,000 years to discover that there was something here called Hermeticism. And thus it also became very famous. And with the coming of the various centos in the time of the Renaissance, depending on the decade that they were enunciated, the Quattrocento and the Quinquecento and so forth, for a while, I would say probably the most highly regarded spiritual approach outside of the activities of the church was Hermeticism. It was reborn again in about 1200, 1300, 1400, 1500, those are the various centos, and then very largely under the influence of, well, I would say, some of you may not like that, the way I express it, of an unfortunate religious development in the world and in Europe that came to be known as Protestantism. I have often been asked whether I was a Protestant, and I usually answered, well, I haven't been protesting anything else except that I lost my country at the end of World War II. So I am not protesting anything. And usually I got sort of big googly-eyed response to that. But let us say this is an important development, because while the Gnostic approach to reality, to life, to God and the human, was there very early, right after or maybe even at the time of Jesus. Because after all, the Gnostic Gospels, as they came to be called, and of which Elaine Pagels, that dear scholar, wrote the first introduction to, these were definitely, expressedly Gnostic, not only in content but in name also, and as such there was no doubt about it. So when Elaine Pagels wrote her lovely little introductory book about the Gnostics, she didn't have to be concerned that she called it the Gnostic Gospel. What else would it have been? But at the same time, when hundreds of years later, the Corpus Hermeticum, the Hermetic body of writings, was all of a sudden, after an absence or an obscuration of hundreds and hundreds of years, came to the fore. There was maybe a little more doubt as to what it should be named and what actually its contents were. And that is why we consider in church history and in the religious history of the West, the Hermetic tradition as a separate chapter, and being really rather different in some respect from the others. Now, what are we dealing with here? First of all, we are dealing with a tradition, a stream of thinking and of devotion that bore the name of Hermes. Hermes, in turn, is a well-known Greek god, one of the children of Zeus, and as such somehow was saved the odium of a heresy, but at the same time was also called a pagan revival because of Hermes. Now, among the Greeks, of course, there was already a Hermes, or Hermes, as you pronounce it in Greek. And this Hermes got his name in Greek from a very peculiar thing. A herm in Greek is a pile of stones. So if you put up a pile of stones in your garden, you can call it a herm. I don't know what good is it going to do you, but you could do it. So, and what The way that developed was that whenever the Greek populace in general, felt for various items of evidence that has come their way, that there has been an activity, an appearance, an opus, as we call it in Latin, a work of Hermes, then there usually appeared a pile of stones that was vaguely shaped like a pyramid. Now, of course, the Egyptian pyramid is something, those are something else of their own, but it's that kind of a shape, and that indicated that, let's say, if we put it in contemporary long language, well, Hermes was here. And that is how, in the immediate post-Christian era, largely centered in the biggest cultural locale in Alexandria, in Greek Egypt, namely Egypt that had now become very much part of the Greek culture, Greek language, and Greek architecture, and Greek statues, and all that sort of thing, had now adopted, at least to a certain extent, the reverence for, one might even say, the worship of Hermes. There have been various statements made by the Hermeticists and by others saying that Hermes received a commission from Zeus, from the highest god, to leave Greece, his original home, and where, of course, the pagan haven was located, and to fly to Egypt and to start something in Egypt. And it's now that something that we are supposed to be talking about this evening, because this was, let us say, a spiritual philosophy and a religious practice attached to it, which had a definite connection with Hermes. Now, it doesn't take a great deal of thought and reflection and speculation to figure out that this Hermes was a manifestation of a very similar archetype to that of the Christian religion. Why? Because even though there were, definite statements made that Hermes was one of those who flew, and I think we have received a gift from my friends in Texas of several volumes of the book, which bears the title They Flew. And this is largely about the Christian saints who had received the occult powers or gift of rising from the earth, or flying sometimes considerable distances, and these powers that they possessed came to be noted by the church, and were never except really condemned as witchcraft or black magic or anything of that sort. They were simply the sort of thing that occasionally is done by saints. for one of the very famous one being one of my favorites, Saint Teresa of Avila, La Madre, the great mother who was single-handedly the reviver of the discalced what's the matter with me? And certainly not Calvinist, but a distant Carmelite church. Now the Mount Carmel in the Holy Land, which is still there in spite of all the bombing and all the terrible things that are going on, Mount Carmel has been recognized from ancient times as a holy place. And so it is believed in a sort of the more esoterically inclined forms of Judaism that Elijah, the prophet Elijah, established a school of the prophets on Mount Carmel in the Holy Land, and that this in turn began a certain tradition. And then when the Christians came along, that tradition took on a Christian coloring and became now a center of a very important monastic movement, which was that of the Carmelites. And then, as it often happens, because people are very individualistic, if I were to start a Gnostic monastic order, which don't be afraid, I'm not about to start, but if I were, and then it very soon would split into certain sections. These people are for this reason, and those people are for that reason. And among them was a Carmelite order, which came to be called the discalced or the shoeless Carmelites, because they practiced their ascetic activities to such an extent that they did not wear shoes. And I imagine that if you, mostly in Spain, if you walk around the dusty and the sharp roads of Spain with no shoes on, you're probably going to get sore feet. And the chief promulgator of the discalced Calvinists promulgators were Saint Teresa of Avila and Saint John of the Cross, San Juan de la Cruz, who was her friend and disciple, and whom she saved from the claws of the Inquisition and the consequent bad fate. These were the two most prominent discalced Carmelites, who then also in due course became saints. Now, what we need to keep in mind that the Carmelites themselves, and I have this from several Carmelite monks, and even from somebody I knew who had been a Carmelite postulant nun and then left the order, that it was common belief, and it probably still is, among the Carmelites that they are, that they have a special Christian tradition, and that tradition comes down from the times when Elijah and the other prophets were doing their thing on Mount Carmel, and that there is sort of a very early, still Judaic toned monastic tradition that comes from Mount Carmel. But certainly the two greatest exponents that we know of, Saint Teresa of Avila, who had championed the Carmelites very greatly, and Saint John of the Cross. So let's say then that there are secret and semi-secret traditions in monastic Christendom, both of the East and of the West. Of the East, I mean all the various, by now, little churches, the Syrian Orthodox Church and the Coptic Orthodox Church and the Greek Orthodox Church and the Russian Orthodox Church, and I better quit recounting them, who were there and who had their own monastic traditions, had their own ascesis, as we call it in Greek. And from there is derived the word asceticism. And ascesis is it just means certain practices. They had their own way of doing things. And that was obviously the case with the Carmelite order as far as Western Christendom was concerned, the Basilian order of the Greek Orthodox Church, and so forth. Now, what we need to keep in mind is that connected with, connected with or not connected with this tradition of Mount Carmel, there developed monastic traditions which were often very secret. I just got, for Christmas, I got a book called The Monastic, what's it called? The Monastic World. And this recounts the story of all the monastic orders, male and female, from the beginning of the Christian era, and it's really a very interesting book. Now, so if you can write a book called The Monastic World, that kind of indicates that there were a heck of a lot of monasteries and nunneries around, and there still are. So there were really the two great outward apostles of monasticism. They were Saint Benedict of Nursia, Italian, who established the rule of Saint Benedict, which not only the Benedictine monks, but a whole bunch of other monastic orders followed. And then there was Saint Cyril of Alexandria, who founded the largest Eastern Orthodox order, to which belonged the famous monks of Mount Athos and various other monastic communities. Now, this being the case, I would say that you would have to be somewhat of a dunce, which I don't think that you are, and I hope I am not, not to recognize that there was something going on within, and yet in some ways in secrecy within both the Church and the East and the West, that had its own tradition, had its own practices, and it's probably, if you can't really classify these things, but I would say that it is very likely that they picked up monastic traditions, perhaps with Alexander's troops in the east, where there was already well-developed monasticism, both of the Hindu and the Buddhist variety, and then transpose that into Christianity. I mean, why not? So we need to remember that from unknown causes there sprang the new fountain of monasticism, which became extremely important, extremely powerful, both in strictly religious terms and in others in the West. When Protestantism came in, of course, Protestantism was diametrically opposed to monasticism. Martin Luther married a runaway nun. I don't know how fast she ran, but she obviously ran fast and didn't run fast enough to get away from Martin Luther. I think that would be the correct. Catherine Bora, who had been a nun. And so, but prior to the coming of the Reformation, there was a tremendous number of monks and nuns in Christendom, both in Eastern and Western Christendom, but in the East there was only one, in fact a monastic, a monk, for instance, is defined by the fact that he lives by a rule. And the rule in the West, in the Western Church, was primarily the rule set by Saint Benedict, the founder of the Benedictine monks. And then from that developed others. And the second big and once very, very important and powerful order being the one that I went to school with and to seminary with, the Cistercian order. It was founded in France, and which is the Reformed Benedictine order. But the Cistercians, who were largely led by Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, their first great abbot of Clairvaux, were still very similar in their customs to the Benedictines. Now, why I brought all this up, I'm not so sure, but I probably had some reason, so you got to trust me. But the main issue really being that the monasticism flourished in a very big way and had contributed to the wide spreading of Christendom all over the world. Because one of the activities that already Saint Benedict had advocated and others was to have missions. And the missions are efforts whereby people who are not familiar with, say, the Christian doctrine or the Christian sacraments can be familiarized with such. So even if you go to such a faraway place as Japan, the first missionaries were Jesuit monks. So the monks were the champions of the the spreading of the faith. Now, that being the case, we need to remember what a tremendous change, and the change really implying a loss, a tremendous change fell upon Christendom when Protestantism came, and when not one, not two, not 100, but thousands and 10,000s of monks were let go, who many of them had never done anything else but did monkery and now didn't know what to do. Yeah, there are some very fine books about that, some of them were mentioned, and also even some in a novelistic. What is the name of our novelist who wrote about the dissolution of the monks in England?
J.C. Sansom.
Sansom, curious name. I mean, yeah, and he wrote very eloquently and very convincingly about the incredible social changes that came upon the British Isles when the monasteries were dissolved by King Henry VIII of the Tudor dynasty, primarily because he had a feud with the Pope, and because he saw in the then just beginning Protestantism a way of aggrandizing his own work and his own power when he made himself the head of the Church of England. And Christendom has never been the same since the monastic orders in so many places were dissolved and changed often into caricatures of their former selves. Now, this is basically what went on. Came the Reformation, and some of the rulers turned Protestants, like Henry, who then used this religious change as an excuse to do away with the monastic orders or to reduce them to penury and lack of power. Because already in those days, to have money made you powerful. Isn't that strange? But it did. So since then we still have, of course, monastic orders. Probably the largest numbers of them at the present time would be in missionary territories, because in order to I hope the sneezing illness is not come, but I have been sneezing before, so don't worry. In any event, I brought all this up because the Hermetic communities that were begun in Alexandria in Egypt, but spread from there to various other places, were really as far as we can determine, the first examples of monasticism, monastic communities. Now, we don't know a great deal about their lifestyle. We don't know too many details in general, but we know that there were communities of Hermetics, as they were often called, the followers of Hermes, and they had their own houses, very much like the monasteries later on, and they were noted with various practices and doctrines which were similar to Christian monasticism and yet vastly different. So let's say now we transport ourselves to Alexandria in Egypt, and we knock on the door of a Hermeticum, a Hermetic house, and they'll ask us, well, why have you come? Well, we have come because we revere Hermes, and we would like to partake of the spiritual gifts that your order, or whatever they called it, spreads. Now I can only mention one, but there are records of many, which is in one of the Hermetic writings. That this is also, this has to be mentioned, that esoteric traditions, or traditions with a good deal of esotericism within them, have seemingly always existed and have attracted people, whether they were Christians or whether they were pagans or whatever they were. The monastic life or something approximating it, and experiences therein have always attracted people, and they attracted men and women. So let me tell you a little bit of a synopsis of one of these stories, which is written in the Hermetic writing Poimandres. All right. Poimandres is a man in Alexandria who would like to know more, would like to feel more, would like to get closer to the world of the gods. So he knocks on the door of a Hermetic dwelling and says, you know, I have been told that you people do interesting things here, and I want to be part of it. Now, I can't assure you that those were the exact words in Greek, but something of that sort. So they let him in, they lead him around various corridors and things like that, you know, a little bit like a labyrinth. And then finally, after several days of wandering, they lead him into a room which in turn joins the garden, and they lead him there, and then they leave him there for a while. And so I said, no, you just stay here and pray, and we'll give you the prayers and the meditations, and then we'll come back and help you to leave. And so it comes to pass, and the man's name is Poimandres, which is a Greek name. And Poimandres now moves about, and he begins to have visions. He hasn't really done anything much. In another book I read that the Hermeticists, or Hermetics, as they are also called, usually had the rule, that was one of their rules, that they, before they were going to be taken into the other worlds and seeing the visions, they had a personal breakthrough kind of vision themselves. They were, for instance, they were not allowed to go, what in times that I tell you, my childhood languages are coming back. in German we call it nüchtern, which means that you haven't eaten anything. Fasting, you might say, that would be the best. So they would be told to eat a little after having fasted, and then they were let into one of the mysterious rooms. Well, this particular Poimandres, who described that and wrote about it in a book, Poimandres went in and he ate of, I don't know, some kind of Egyptian crackers or something like that, and soon after he had put a little bit of energy into his body, he began to see strange things. And then they came and helped him, and it's been a long time that I read Poimandres, but you can find it in G.R.S. Mead's translation, who you may recall was H.P. Blavatsky's secretary, and a very learned man, wherein he was, let us say, he was in a very supportive environment for his endeavors. And then I'm trying to recall, Poimandres is a fairly long scripture. It's very nicely translated in Mead's Thrice Greatest Hermes, great big books. In any event, he now begins to see and feel unusual things, and one of them being that he is confronted with a gigantic figure. You know, in all the works, Hermetic and Gnostic and so, very often there appear descriptions of gigantic figures. Even the American continent has its own traditions among the natives and so forth, that at one time at least a portion of the American continent was inhabited by giants, really big fellows, and presumably remnants, skeletons, skulls, things like that were found in many places, and they were huge. But nobody seems to have really reported much, although I may be wrong on that score, of the living giants going around, because they must have lived before they died, and seemingly that seems to be the order of nature. In any event, so he is confronted with this giant, and that's too much for him to take. He says, "Too bad, I am not made for interaction with giants, and I'm going to get out of here." So he leaves the Hermetic establishment, but after a while one of the Hermeticists says, "Look, that was only the beginning, and you are likely to experience some very interesting things. So look, I will help you, and I will vouch for you, so if there is something happening, I am going to defend you, okay? So don't go away yet, but stay." So he stays, but he goes outside to get a little bit of air. And then when he comes back into the building, the Hermeticist, the Hermetic monk tells him, well, you know what, I think no, you had enough vacation time now. So why don't you come back in the building, and I want to show you a different, you may see a different image from the one that you saw before. So he said, all right. So he walks in, and they take him into this back room, and he goes in, and there is the gigantic figure. And he looks at it, and he almost runs away, because the gigantic figure is himself. He recognizes his own features in the giant, only the giant is way bigger than he is. So then he goes and holds conference with the Hermetic monks, and they tell him that he saw an image of his own, which is really him. That is what he really looks like in the higher worlds. But inasmuch as he has undergone an internal change, he can attest that this figure does resemble him, and he could interact with him, which then he goes and does. That's the main scene in Poimandres, which has been published and was written down and so forth, and acts as an example of what was done by the Hermeticists. We still don't know exactly what, but we know that a higher and thereby perhaps gigantic and different looking self of this Alexandrian Greek appeared. He had a confrontation with his own self, and the way he explained it, it's difficult to tell, but it's in the book. You know, saying it's in the book, that he became aware that he had an other self, and that this other self appeared sometimes gigantic, and appeared wise and kind, and counseled him in all kinds of ways, and then after a period of time the giant said to him, well, now you see what I look like, and you will also see that when you compare what you just saw now with what you see in the mirror, that there is a similarity, and I leave that as a memory with you, and let you think about it and pray about it and so forth, because this is very important. It's going to be very important for your future. And with that he leaves, and he never saw the giant again, but he had an utterly powerful, overwhelmingly impressive experience, which, as he said, was not the only one that led to others, but then he doesn't write those down. So anyway, what are we dealing with here? We are dealing with one single manifestation, where at other times, in other places, there were others, of an individual being confronted with his big self. The gigantic contours of the Hermetic figure that he encountered are just a manifestation. They wanted to show him that they are much bigger, that they are much smarter, that they are much wiser than he is. And the showing to the giant, to him, was of that nature. Well, inasmuch as the fellow to whom this happened wrote it all down, because the Greeks were big writers, you know. It hadn't been for Plato and Aristotle and Socrates and all the rest of them. They were always writing stuff down, and we wouldn't know a doggone thing about them. So it's important to remember, and they are psychologists today. Unfortunately, my non-Algerian mind doesn't recollect the name at this point, but one of the pretty strong sort of neo-Jungian psychologists, I can't just think of his name now, but he said that whenever you have an unusual experience, write it down, write it down. Well, unfortunately, I read his statement, and I said, well, all right. So here I was. I had an unusual dream. I had a this, I had a that. And I spent all my time writing. I said, doggone, this doesn't seem to be very practical. But of course I was writing other things at other times, but somehow I felt that this was ultimately not a very revealing practice. You will probably, some of you will probably remember the name of he was a well-known psychologist. So now what we have from this description primarily, because the other Hermetic books were mostly mythology and all sorts of things, but very seldom telling people basically what to do. When the Corpus Hermeticum became common knowledge during the Renaissance, it was translated into Italian and so forth. Let's say it became likely that something was described here that really happened, and that this was actually a practice, and that the practice seemingly in its impact nature consisted of the fact that people had some kind of contact with their other or higher selves. Now you may think at one point or the other that when Madame Blavatsky wrote about the higher self, that she was familiar with the Hermetic Corpus Hermeticum, and not only was she familiar with it, but that there was a connection. Now, of course, we need to remember that the Hermeticists were in Egypt. They were descendants of the ancient Egyptians who, however, had learned something else, something new. And that something new included their own selfhood in a higher, in a more transfigured and glorious and powerful aspect. So that is probably, in my opinion, and I must confess that with all my high regard for G.R.S. Mead, I haven't read all of his commentaries on the Poimandres or the other Hermetic writings, but obviously it is evident that these people had some techniques whereby they were able to visually or in other ways connect the people who came to them with an aspect of themselves that they were not aware of, but which did represent in some fashion their own higher selfhood. And that much appears, all you have to do is read the Poimandres or Mead's commentaries on it or so forth. Now, this would indicate, therefore, that there was a mystico-magical practice in Alexandria in Egypt, which connected people with their own transcendental selfhood. And that there were teachings also to the effect that if you do what we tell you to do, you are going to be closer and closer to your eternal selfhood, and you are going to learn what you can become. That's it. Now, obviously this is not a Christian teaching. Although, an apostle or epistle or somebody could easily come forward and say, well, look, if you do what we tell you, you're going to be in heaven. It's going to be very nice. You're going to learn more of what you really are than you have so far, and so you keep working on it. So it's not an unchristian practice. It's not something that a Christian couldn't do. They weren't worshipping devils or anything of that sort, quite to the contrary. So, but these and similar incidents appear in the Corpus Hermeticum, of which Mead made the most, up to now as far as I know, the most complete translation, which is embodied in his 3-volume, I think it is, big book, Thrice Greatest Hermes. So obviously we have evidence that there was a Hermetic practice which the practitioners attributed to the help of Hermes, and it's symbolically that's quite possible. Why? Because Hermes is the traveler. There are statues of his in many places. My favorite one is the one in Paris, which is right out in front of that plaza by the Palais des Invalides. When you looked at it, there's a gigantic statue of Hermes, or Mercury, if you want to call him by the Roman name. And he has wings on his helmet, he has wings on his shoes, he has a scepter that has wings on it, and obviously he's flying through the air. So maybe that was one of his special gifts, even as we see it among the saints like Saint Teresa. And Saint Teresa could, in a record time, but I mean really record time, she could fly from Avila to Madrid just like that. They still saw her taking off in Avila, and boom, she was in Madrid. And there was King Philip greeting her. Well, Madre, you have come again. And things like that. So, there is a similarity. Now, identity, I don't know, but there is a similarity. So now we have to keep in mind that if indeed these similarities existed, and the report in Poimandres, which is very sort of prosaic. I mean, this guy who went in there, he's not jumping around from the floor to the ceiling as to what a great miracle happened to him. No, it's all right, I know that's what you Hermetics do, so teach me some more. That, that kind of thing. No wonder then that in a subsequent historical period, when these sorts of things became more and more rare, and when people were not able or not qualified to do it, the Hermetic tradition or the calling upon the Hermetic tradition was quite prominent and quite important. But we have to remember one thing, that it is quite evident from the Poimandres and other Hermetic writings that these people were given at least a potential prophecy. If you do what we tell you to do, you are going to see and interact with your true self. You are going to find the self of yours that maybe you were looking for already, but you haven't been able to find before. And that this indicates part of a certain progression. And that is the progression, somewhat changed, somewhat altered and so forth, that you find in Blavatsky, indicating that if you keep on doing what you are supposed to do, you'll meet your true self. The self that is your divine self. And when you meet that one, then you have risen a stairway to heaven, and you will find more. Now, when Blavatsky came to America and was doing her antics in New York and all of that, what country did she come from? She came from Egypt. From where was she getting letters from? And just appear, fall out of a closet or something like that. From Egypt. And the signatures were sometimes Egyptian names like Tuatid Bey and so forth, which would be contemporary Egyptian names. And she showed those letters to her friends. She said, see, they know us there, and they are going to help us. So let's go on with our work. Well, not in those words, but that sort of thing. So obviously there was a tradition, and in the most plausible way, it could be called a Hermetic tradition, which was still present in secret, no doubt, among various people in Egypt, and these were some of the first people who contacted her, and maybe related in some fashion to this whole mystery about masters. But as I say, I don't like the word master very much. But whatever the case may be, anyway, there were people who knew more than she did and who were willing to communicate to her some of the things that she knew. And then went on from there. So we have a Hermetic heritage as well. And this Hermetic heritage, the only thing we can really connect it with is the Poimandres of Hermes Trismegistus in Mead's translation of the thrice greatest Hermes. So this is another mystery that is solved, or at least almost solved. and it may be in turn connected with the very last actions and planned actions of Blavatsky, that if you do things right, you are going to know your true self, and you are going to get to your true home, and you are going to live, you're going to be a living miracle. That's why they connected her with the spiritualists, because these are the kind of things that the spiritualists would communicate to each other. Well, I used to live, 500 years ago in Babylon, but now I'm coming back to New York, all kinds of, pardon the expression, balderdash. I had some good friends of spiritualists and honest people. I tell you, they wouldn't tell a lie, in no way whatsoever. But it's still a twisting of another situation. And I think it is a twisting of the Hermetic model. So now, why has, and then I'll have to probably conclude, there has to be a reason why this particular practice or these particular phenomena were coming forth at the time of Blavatsky. I can't tell you what they are, but I'm going to nevertheless. And what I mean by that is that Blavatsky, unlike so many other teachers before her and after her, Blavatsky knew the system within which she worked. She knew that there were the 7 planes and then some after that, and that if you practice certain things, if you allied yourself with these other forces, then you might have a chance to learn more about your own self, and not in the psychoanalytic way, which is also, I'm sure that C.G. Jung would have said, well, of course, what else would you learn about but yourself? Which I tend to agree with. But on the whole, that there is a way of progression. There is a way of transformation. And it's not Charlie Darwin's evolution, but it is a change into something new. And elements of this process were imparted to her, and she intended to continue with them further, except that she only had so much time, because the Grim Reaper apparently works in Tibet and India also, and came and took H.P. Blavatsky to another world. But she knew something. She was a Gnostic. She knew, first of all, who she was and why she was here. And those are important things to know. And I think that in our own bumbling way, and I include myself readily in that, we are in the process of knowing that also. And then we will have title to be real Gnostics. Thank you.